Thanks, Pastor Paul. It's good to be here. Good to see you all. That's obviously a picture of Jerusalem. I want to look at the As Birds Flying Bible prophecy today, but particularly about Anzacs in the Bible, and there is certainly a connection there with Australian and New Zealand soldiers who fought in the Middle East and were a pretty crucial part actually of the fulfilment of this prophecy. And I suppose Anzac Day and all that, it's a time when people think about the sacrifices that people made. And in some theatres of war, if they hadn't gone and fought and made those sacrifices, our lifestyle and system of government could certainly be very different to what it is now. So we're thankful for what they did and mindful of all that. And hopefully you'll find this interesting in terms of their part in what happened around Jerusalem in 1917. So As Birds Flying, one of the most significant prophecies of modern times. We'll see how every part of it was fulfilled to the letter, and that the Lord is faithful to his promises and his word and the things that he says. As the scripture says, remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God and there's none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying my counsel shall stand and I will do all my good pleasure. And they're wonderful, encouraging scriptures for us, aren't they? Because when we think about the promises that God's made to us of healing and provision and just keeping us till the Lord returns, and then we're going to rise up to meet him in the air and live forever. And that's a faithful promise from the Lord, isn't it? And there are things, as we go through these things, hopefully we find it just really encouraging for our personal walk. It's faith-building stuff just to think about the Lord's love for us and that we can rely on his promises for us. This is a little bit here about the 7 times punishment. In Leviticus chapter 26, of course, Israel were God's people, and God said here that if they turned away from him and disobeyed him, then he would walk contrary to Israel and punish them 7 times for their sins. And then down in verse 28 we see it repeated there. So 7 times, of course, that requires a little bit of explanation. A time is 360 days, and we see a little formula here in Bible prophecy, Ezekiel chapter 4, I have appointed thee each day for a year, and then in Numbers as well, after the number of the days in which you search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year shall you bear your iniquities, even 40 years. So we see a day for a year, which would make a time in Bible prophecy 360 years. Therefore, 7 times is 2,520 years. Now, Israel did, as we know, turn away from God. And so beginning in 604 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, ascended to the throne, 604, 2,520 years brings us to 1917. So the punishment upon Israel because of their disobedience started in 604. The reason, if you're doing the maths in your head and wondering why it doesn't come to 1916, the reason why it's 1917 is because there's no year 0. So you go straight from 1 BC to 1 AD, and therefore it adds up to 1917. Luke chapter 21. Now we've fast forwarded to the times of Jesus when he was on the earth, and talking about the last days, the return of Jesus Christ and so forth. And one of the things that it says here is that they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So what it's saying is that as part of this punishment, that Jerusalem would be ruled by the Gentiles or non-Israel people until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So if we start from 604 BC, we come to 1917, and right down through the ages, we only have to look at the pages of history to see that Jerusalem was ruled by others, starting with Babylon. Then the Medes and the Persians came in and took the Babylonian Empire. But when we get to the times of Jesus, of course, the Romans were ruling, and so on it went. Later on, it was the Turkish Ottoman Empire right before 1917, but we'll look at that in a minute. So if you get nothing else out of this presentation, I just did this as a bit of a visual, because This 7 times punishment, of course, Israel was a great nation before God, as God had promised to Abraham right back in the book of Genesis and so forth. And so in 1000 BC, we've got a nation of Israel. But this is a relief from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, of the Assyrian invasion of Israel. So anyway, we fast forward to 500 BC, no nation of Israel. And 200 BC, still no nation of Israel. 30 AD, of course, the Romans are ruling. Jesus, of course, was on the earth. And one of the things after Jesus rose from the dead, you'll recall, was when will you restore the kingdom to Israel? So God had a plan of salvation through the Holy Ghost, we know that, but they being natural at that time and not yet spirit-filled, they were painfully aware that they were ruled by the Romans, and they were asking Jesus, when's Israel going to rule again, so to speak? So that's, again, another reference to the fact that Jerusalem was trodden down of the Gentiles. 500 AD, still no Israel. 1914, still no Israel. But we're very much aware now that in modern times there is a nation of Israel. So it's a fairly easy one to put forward to people when we're witnessing to them and so forth. Look, the Bible said this would happen. The nation of Israel disappeared off the pages of history for 2,500 years, and now it's back. It's a fulfilment of Bible prophecy. Okay, but back to 1917, the Great War. Of course, it was called the war to end all wars. Unfortunately and sadly, that wasn't the case. But the attitude at the time was, don't just stand looking, go and help. And I was doing some reading, masses of soldiers leaving places like Fremantle to go off to fight in the Middle East and in Europe and so forth. And there was a prevailing attitude of get involved, you'll come home a hero. There was people that thought we'll go and fight for a few months and come home as heroes. But of course, sadly, as we know, it was a pretty horrific thing to have to be involved in. And I just came across this the other day. Of course, there's all sorts of ANZAC Day articles on the internet and so forth last Sunday. This is a young man, Reginald Garth, who was 12 years old when he stowed away on one of those ships, hoping that after the ship had gone, they'd let him fight because, well, you're here. So, of course, they didn't. But how'd you be? 12 years old. He couldn't convince anyone he was old enough to fight. I wonder why. And he seems to have like a medic badge on his... I'm not sure about that, but I suppose they found him something to do because he was halfway around the world away from home at 12 years old. This young man, James Charles Martin, was the youngest recorded individual to die fighting with the Anzacs in World War I. He was only 14. What actually happened was he wanted to enlist and he said to his parents, tell them I'm 18, and they refused. And he said, well, if you don't do it, I'll run away and enlist under an assumed name somewhere else. And I was thinking about it and thought, what a position for his parents to be in, because if he did that and anything happened, they wouldn't know what name he used. They'd possibly never hear of his fate at all. So in the end, they relented and told the authorities that he was 18. And of course, he was a strapping young lad for his age, so he managed to get away with it. Sadly, really. Many of these young men went to fight in the Middle East. Australian young men and New Zealand, and there's some pictures of the Australian Light Horse and the New Zealand Mounted Rifles in Palestine, as it was known then, because of course there was no nation of Israel. It was known as Palestine. And the Light Horse advancing on Beersheba, which we're going to look at a little bit, and the Imperial Camel Corps. So Jerusalem in 1917, World War I, the most famous and most desired city in the world, had for exactly 400 years been dominated by the Turks. It was soon to be delivered in the most incredible way over 2,000 years prior. This was prophesied, not only the day, but the manner in which the city would be delivered. And that's what we're looking at in terms of the Bible prophecy today. And so I think we know Palestine, Jerusalem, Beersheba just a little bit down here, and Egypt, which was the base for the British Imperial forces that were operating in Palestine at the time. And this guy was a key figure in the whole thing, General Allenby, known as the Bull, God-fearing, Bible-believing, which, of course, I think it would be safe to say would have been very common at the time. I think 100 years ago, believing in God, reading your Bible, going to church was certainly a more common thing than it is today. And, you know, there's various references to things that he did and said that certainly indicate that to be the case. We don't know exactly what he believed, but that certainly seems to be the case, that he was a God-fearing man. He was called to replace Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Murray on the 28th of June 1917. So there's 6 months to go in the year. He was not happy about it. Murray was no mug. He knew about war and fighting and so forth, but the campaign hadn't been going well. And so when he was asked to do the job, he said, the last man failed and I don't see why it's going to be any different for me. So he wasn't keen to take on the job. He was made aware of Bible prophecies relating to the deliverance of Jerusalem, and also shown 2 books, Light for the Last Days by H. Grattan Guinness and The Fullness of Nations. And I forget the author of that one, and I can't read that, so I'll have to do some research afterwards to find out about that one. But the thing was, the people that wrote these books in the 1880s both predicted Jerusalem would be delivered in 1917. It's because they'd been reading their Bibles and they'd seen about the prophecy about the 7 times punishment. That was the basis for their statements. He also had a meeting with the First Sea Lord, Lord Fisher, who told Allenby that as the Commander-in-Chief he would be God's instrument to capture Jerusalem. So he's got 6 months to do the job. The other guy hadn't done very well, and so they're trying to convince this man that it's going to happen, and it's going to happen quickly, and God's going to have a hand in it. Over the next few hours, he heard about the prophecy relating to the capture of Jerusalem. Lord Fisher told him that aircraft would be essential to the success of the campaign, and that's recorded by Lord Fisher's secretary. What was he shown? What made these men come to these conclusions? So just reiterating, the 7 times punishment started in 604 BC, and so 2,520 years gets us to 1917. That's the first thing to remember. And the second thing is, as it says here in Daniel chapter 12, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away and the abomination that makes desolate set up, it goes on to say, blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,305 and 30 days. So we understand with the invasion of Israel, because of their disobedience, that the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the abomination which makes desolate set up, the dome on the rock, or dome of the rock in Jerusalem, which is built on the old temple site, really is a pretty strong visual representation of this Bible prophecy being fulfilled. Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And so instead of Solomon's temple and the daily sacrifice that was instituted in the Old Testament there happening in Jerusalem, we've got this Islamic mosque built on that site instead. And so perhaps we could make a pretty strong argument that that relates to the abomination that makes desolate. But blessed is he that waits and comes to 1335. And remember the day for a year formula. So we're looking for the 1335th year. 622, the beginning of the Mohammedan era, and the Mosque of Omar gets built in the holy place. And so 1305 and 30 days. I think I pressed the right button there. Yeah, day for a year, we talked about that. This is a coin minted in 1917, and it's got on it 1917 on one side. But if we use this little table here to work out what these Arabic figures mean, that is actually, you guessed it, 1335. Because on the Muslim calendar that was being used at the time in the area by the Turks, it was 1335 on their calendar. So now we've got 1917 and we've got 1335, and they merge in this particular year on our calendar. The reason I say that is that this calendar here is a lunar calendar, where ours is solar. So it's based on the moon doing laps of the earth. 12 laps is a lunar year, whereas our calendar is based on the time that it takes for the earth to do a full circuit around the sun. And so our year is 365 and a quarter days. That one's 354. And therefore, if you do your sums, that's pretty amazing that those two numbers merged on the same year of the respective calendars. So the 1335th year on the Mohammedan lunar calendar equaled 1917 AD. After 1,335 lunar years dating from 622 AD on our calendar, the Turks dropped their Mohammedan calendar of lunar year reckoning and adopted the European calendar, which we use. The lunar calendar of Turkey, having served its prophetic purpose, was dropped as if by the very hand of God. So it's like, okay, it's done its job now, we'll get rid of it and go with the other one. The next thing is the day. Haggai chapter 2. Consider now from this day and upward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, even from the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, consider it, from this day forth will I bless you. Now bear in mind, we've got a 7 times punishment, a prophecy which is in motion, and yet this passage here talks about from this day forth will I bless you. You know, ending of the curse, ending of the punishment, and a restoration of things as God promised. The 9th month of the Hebrew year, so now we've got a third calendar involved, right? The Hebrew calendar. The 9th month of the Hebrew year is Kislev. This is also a lunar calendar, so therefore the months shift compared to ours every year. The best analogy perhaps that I can use is Easter. You know how every year it's on a different date? So this is similar. 9th month of the Hebrew year is Kislev. This month corresponds to the part of the November and December of our calendar, the Hebrew calendar being lunar. The date varies. In 1917, the 25th of Kislev was December the 10th, and on the 24th of Kislev was December the 9th. So we've got 3 different calendars now, and they're merging on one date, which in our calendar was the 9th of December 1917. Again, bear in mind, if we were looking at 1918, the 24th of Kislev would have been a different date. Or if we looked in 1916, it would have been a different date. So we've got these 3 separate calendars merging on one date, 9th of December 1917 on our calendar. Now, then there's the manna. Isaiah 31, which was written centuries before Christ was on the earth, of course. As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending also he will deliver it, and passing over he will preserve it. So here's a promise from the Lord, that Jerusalem will be defended, delivered and preserved. So we've had centuries of Gentile rule because God said so, and then God's saying there's going to be a time when I'm going to deliver it and I'm going to defend it and I'm going to preserve it. And it's going to be the end of this punishment and a restoration of things. Now, Isaiah living somewhere around, from memory, 700 BC. So who knows what God showed him or how he did it or what he saw or came to understand, but he just said the Lord's going to do it like birds flying. So anyway, back to the war, because we need to now look at the history to see what actually happened. By 1917, the new weapon, the state-of-the-art weapon for warfare, was this thing, with canvas wings and a propeller that someone wound it up, and, you probably read about the Red Baron. He really was in World War I. Snoopy wasn't. Anyway, the new weapon was aircraft. A fortnight after his arrival, Allenby cabled home a list of requirements which included 60 modern aircraft. Now, one would assume that he did that largely because of the advice that he was given when they showed him the Bible prophecy. And so there's some pictures of these guys flying, those magnificent men in their flying machines and all that stuff. And interesting, they hid their airplanes in the desert when they weren't using them so that the Turks didn't just fly over and drop one of those handheld bombs out the window, but they didn't have windows, did they? They just wore goggles. So, it's interesting to think of the time and what it was like in the Middle East there, as birds flying. Now, I sort of also like to reflect on something. I think I'm right in saying that the Wright brothers' first flight was in 1903, and we've all seen the old grainy black and white videos of guys strapping things to their arms and jumping off jetties and trying to flap. They're trying to work out how to make flight work. But for 2,506 years after that prophecy started, no one did it successfully. And then in 1903, the Wright brothers finally did it. Now, is that a coincidence? Or did God have in mind, I'm going to deliver this place as birds flying, so I'm going to need aircraft? I mean, if you organise a birthday party, you think about, what am I going to need? I'm going to need a cake, I'm going to need presents, I'm going to need to invite people, I'm going to need a venue, I'm going to need this, that and the other. We know how to organise stuff, right? Well, seems to me God's organised and executed and delivered on his word in an amazing way with this prophecy, and he knew what he needed to make it all work. I've got no evidence for any of this, but I do like to think about the fact that what happened? Did the Wright brothers go to bed one night and God thought, come on fellas, you need to get a wriggle on here, and so he gave them they dreamt something or whatever and woke up the next morning and that's how to do it? And I don't know, but it's an amazing thing to think that within 14 years of this prophecy being due to be fulfilled, someone worked out how to manufacture and fly aircraft. So, coincidence, or did God have a hand in it? The squadron of the Royal Air Force that was operating in and around Jerusalem and Palestine at the time was the 14th Bomber Squadron of the Royal Air Force, and their badge and motto is "I spread my wings and keep my promise." I like that one. And where it came from, it was actually given to them after Jerusalem was delivered. And there's quite a process involved. Like, you can't just get a crayon and write something on a piece of paper and stick it on the side of an aircraft and say that's our motto now. It's got to go through government channels and so forth. But what happened was His Highness Emir Abdullah of Jordan was the one that came up with it, because he felt that divine intervention had saved Jerusalem from destruction in 1917, and aircraft were central to God's plan. So that's interesting, isn't it? So I'm just trying to read that last bit. I'm colourblind and it's not clear to me what it says, so just give me a moment. During General Allenby's campaign in 1917, the Allied Air Force had complete control of the skies over Palestine. There you go. As birds flying. So now we're getting to the Australian bit. Major General Sir Harry Chauvel. He was commander of the ANZAC mounted troops. He was in command of the 1st Division of the Australian Light Horse at the taking of the wells of Beersheba on the 31st of October 1917. So an important date and an important thing, because they had pretty much run out of water or on the verge of. So the soldiers needed water, they're in the desert. The horses need a lot of water for them to be able to proceed up towards Jerusalem. So 1917, the 31st of October, they needed to take the wells at Beersheba to get access to the water. The Turks were dug in trenches around Beersheba to defend it. This is 40 days before General Allenby walked into Jerusalem. Interesting. It's also an important date in history because it was the date that the Balfour Declaration was agreed upon. It was officially signed off in Parliament a few days later, but that was the day that the various nations, British and the French, I'm not sure if there are others involved, but that was the day that they agreed to it. And of course it was the Balfour Declaration that talked about a homeland for the Jews, and it was because of the Balfour Declaration that Israel was reformed as a nation in 1948, which is a significant event, of course, when we think about Bible prophecy and so forth. So anyway, they need to take the wells at Beersheba. When we were having Easter camps up at Hawker, there was one of these actually on the wall in the town hall in Hawker, and that's King George V, and that's Chevelle there. So you might have seen that around the place in your travels. So we've got Beersheba, and the map there shows the positions of the various troops. But what happened was that the horses could smell the water. So they were literally chomping at the bit, let me at it. But there was the slight complication of the fact that there was Turks in there with guns and artillery and stuff like that. And there's various eyewitness accounts from people like Trooper Ian Idris, or Jack Idris as he was known, about what happened. What they decided to do was the last cavalry charge in wartime. They were mounted infantry, so what they normally would do was ride in on their horses, jump off, get their rifles, get down and start shooting. That was their normal mode of operation. But what they decided to do was a full cavalry charge, ride all the way in there to take Beersheba, which you can imagine was a fairly stunning and confronting thing to do, but such was their determination. The decision was made and they bravely did it. It seems that that sort of threw the Turks because they've got sights on their rifles and their artillery, and they were madly trying to adjust their sights down as these horses kept charging towards them, so that as they shot it would actually hit the people that they were trying to shoot at. But they really struggled, and so a lot of the firing actually went over the heads of the troopers as they rode in, and the fact that they never stopped to get off their horses threw them as well. And so that was a help in them actually making it in, and they did take Beersheba, and that was really important because basically 6 weeks later that enabled them to take Jerusalem on the 9th of December 1917. This is another book, 800 Horsemen by Colonel Stringer, Australia's Place in Bible Prophecy, it says down here, and the statement is made, attributed to Field Marshal Allenby. Without the involvement of the Australian Light Horsemen, I doubt that there would be a modern nation of Israel. So Allenby is attributed as making that statement in this book. So now Jerusalem's in sight. 1917, 1335, when the British Army was approaching Jerusalem, General Allenby saw that it might be necessary to shell the city. He cabled the War Cabinet for definite instructions. They said, you work it out. It's known as a reflex handball. And still not satisfied, he communicated directly with King George V. The king said, pray about it. That's from firstworldwar.com. Allenby did so. The ensuing Turkish surrender came without a shot being fired or a single drop of blood being shed within the precincts of the city. And I think we know why. Just to digress a little bit, the Turks had a saying, apparently, that when the waters of the Nile flow into Palestine, then will a prophet of the Lord come and drive the Turk from this land. Impossible? Well, the thing was, because of 30 million sandbags, 2 million square feet of timber, a lot of pipes and stuff. Oh, there you go, 300 miles of water pipe. They actually piped water from the Nile into Palestine to provide water for the troops. So there you go, just an interesting sidelight there. The waters of the Nile flowed into Palestine. Now, the other thing, we can't be sure about this. I'm still hunting for definitive evidence that says it in black and white, but there are various accounts that General Allenby had his biplanes fly over Jerusalem and drop leaflets saying, "Surrender the city." And they were signed, well, depends what you read, Allah en Nebi, Allah Nebi, but the accounts say, and I'm not Arabic, I think Nebi means prophet, Allah means God, and so the Turks took that as a prophet of God's telling us to leave, and so perhaps that's a big factor in why they decided to just walk out and surrender the city. When the Arabs saw General Allenby's name on the leaflet, they interpreted it as meaning Allah's prophet, and so they fled without a shot being fired. They came out with a white flag. They actually found, the first British soldiers they found were cooks. They were going to the local village to get eggs, and they got lost on the way back, and they came across this Turkish guy saying, "Are you a British soldier?" "I should certainly say so." And they said, "Good, we want to surrender the city." So I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have been expecting that to happen, but that's what happened. I hope you can see this okay, but what happened was that Allenby, obviously he'd thought about it, prayed about it, and what he did was he deliberately left an escape path for the Turks out this way. He left a gap. So he effectively invited them, you know, if you'd like to leave now, because by now his forces have moved up on the city and are ready to take it. And so what he did was he left an escape path and invited them. So if you'd like to leave, you know, exit stage left. This is the way that you can do it. And they did. At sunset on December the 8th, the Turks began evacuating Jerusalem. Well, there it is. That's about the surrender. Sergeants Hercombe and Sedgwick. The conversation is reported to have gone just the way I mentioned that it did. And there's a picture of Australian light horse entering Jerusalem. Australian light horse riding through the outskirts of Jerusalem. And this is General Allenby walking into Jerusalem through the Jaffa Gate, and the Gate of the Friend, and he's quoted as saying, "A greater force than I is at work." And he was right about that. He's also quoted as saying that he walked into Jerusalem because only the Messiah should ride into Jerusalem, which I thought was interesting. And this is the whole ceremony where he read out a statement saying, "Look, we're your friends. All people that choose to stay in Jerusalem will be respected, will treat you well," was the gist of what he was saying. Destruction was still a threat. We've seen the hand of aircraft in delivering Jerusalem. There's also the aspect of defending it and preserving it. The city had been recovered as birds flying, but when the Turks found that they could not recapture Jerusalem, they trained their guns on the city to lay it in ruins. It was the Royal Flying Corps which prevented them carrying out the destruction. We've probably all heard the statement about air superiority in warfare. Repelling the Turks' efforts to destroy Jerusalem, the Royal Flying Corps was likened to a flock of angry birds. That's a quote from a captured Turkish officer. So fulfilled to the day and the month according to the Hebrew calendar, the year according to our calendar, and the Arabic calendar that we referred to. All Hebrew days begin at the previous sunset, which is interesting that they started evacuating at sunset on December the 8th. So from sunset on December the 8th and all through the night, Turkish troops were evacuating Jerusalem. By early morning, they'd gone. So pinpoint accuracy. As birds flying, the Lord will defend, deliver and preserve Jerusalem on the day that the Bible predicted. The city was delivered and defended without a single shot being fired within its walls. Not one building was damaged. Not a drop of blood was shed inside the city walls. This was without precedent in World War I. So I thought this is quite clever. I can't claim credit for this slide, but you know, as birds flying, the picture changes from birds to aircraft. Just another interesting little sidelight as we sort of draw to a close. The prayer book of Edward VI, first printed in 1552 or published in 1552. It's the Book of Common Prayer, which was used in Britain. And there's the history of the fact that Isaiah 31 was the reading down through the ages. It was revised in 1882. Isaiah 31 became the lesson for December 8th. So in England, on December the 8th, no doubt people would have been praying for the soldiers and all that sort of thing, and probably for the war to be over and various things like that. On December the 8th, the lesson that they were reading was As Birds Flying, So the Lord Defend, Deliver and Preserve Jerusalem. And of course, it happened the following day. Or perhaps we could count it as from sunset that day. Prophecy fulfilled on the day of the lesson. Accurately fulfilled prophecy, amazing. Well, of course it's amazing, but when God constantly reassures us about the sureness of his promises and his love for us, we come to expect, don't we, that the Lord will do wonderful things, that he'll deliver us in our time of trouble, that he'll hear our prayers, that he'll work in our life, and we know we've got eternal life to come. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto you do well that you take heed, as unto a light that shines in a dark place until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. So God fulfilled the prophecy in an incredible way, and it's just very exciting stuff. I think there's more stuff here, but yep, we get the idea the Lord's coming back. So we'll leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Pastor Mark. It really brings that prophecy to life. It's probably one of my favourites. It's got so many aspects to it. I know I shouldn't try to say anything much after that, but it's so hard not to. You just see how the Lord has used the various calendars. You know how Jerusalem is divided into 4 quarters, and one of them is Jewish, one of them is Muslim, and the other 2 are a form of Christian. And so he's used the Jewish calendar, he's used the Muslim calendar, and he's used the Catholic calendar, which the world has adopted, and told them all what's going to happen through their own calendars. He's also brought the British into it through their Book of Common Prayer, maybe the Americans through the Wright brothers. And so the world has had such incredible warning about all of this. And you look back, I was just flipping through my Bible then, back to Leviticus 26 where it starts, which is written way back. So we've got the time there where the law is given. So we're talking whatever time that is, around 3,500 years ago, that it was laid out in accurate detail, and point upon point has been laid out in accurate detail to be fulfilled in this time, which was the beginning of the latter rain, the beginning of the 1900s. We're looking at the return of Jesus Christ, and all this is sort of opening up. And you just go, wow! the immensity of the detail that is in that particular prophecy warning about the end times. And we're 100 years plus on from there now. How much time have we got left? It's a very exciting story. But thank you, Pastor Mark. It gets the mind and the heart going. We've got things we can tell people about.